Good morning or good evening, depending upon where you are listening. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the webinar, Hope, Power, and Responsibility, Creating Healthy Societies, with Kathryn Goldman Schuyler and Éliane Ubalijoro. For today's webinar, Kathryn will begin with her presentation, followed by Éliane's presentation. After that, they will share a short dialogue, which will lead into a Q&A session. Because the Q&A session occurs at the end of the webinar, I'm advising you all to write down any questions as they may come up throughout the webinar so you will not forget. In order to ask a question, you must click the hand icon on your control panel to raise your hand. Once you do that, I will be able to unmute you. I will then say your name so you know that it is your turn to ask a question. If you do not have audio available, you are able to type a question instead on your control panel, and I can read it out loud. Please keep in mind we may not be able to get to every question. Also, Kathryn and Éliane are giving away 2 free copies of Creative Social Change. I will randomly select 2 people after the webinar and I will reach out to the winners. I'm now going to introduce our 2 wonderful thought leaders. Kathryn Goldman Schuyler is a sociologist, organizational consultant, and somatic educator, supporting leaders in moving with awareness through challenging change. She has helped hundreds of executives to cultivate healthy organizations and creates learning about leadership, ethics, sustainability, research, and consulting skills for graduate students as a professor of organizational development at Alliant International University. Dr. Goldman Schuyler is the author and editor of ILA's 2016 Building Leadership Bridges book, Creative Social Change, Leadership for a Healthy World, as well as its 2014 volume, Leading with Spirit, Presence, and Authenticity. Next, Éliane Ubalijoro is the founder and executive director of Clear International Development Incorporation, a consulting group harnessing global networks for sustainable systems development. She is a professor of practice for public and private sector partnerships at McGill University's Institute for the Study of International Development. She is a member of Rwanda's National Science and Technology Council. Éliane was a mentor for the first Global Women in Science Leadership Workshop, and more recently, she contributed to a panel on strengthening the interplay between discovery and innovation at the invitation of the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Thank you again for joining us, and without further ado, Kathryn, I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here with you, Jill, and Éliane, and all of you who are listening. Our conversation this morning about leadership and hope, I'll start looking specifically at the inner ground of leading, focusing on my action research and how I've worked with others to help us all wake up in the workplace and use that for culture change, linking that as well with the wonderful book that Jill has mentioned. Next, Éliane will speak about her experiences in Rwanda, and she has a wonderful chapter in the book on that, and what Rwanda has gone through with post-traumatic growth and transformative leadership, and how that relates to feminine leadership and feminine wisdom, after which she and I will dialogue, and then all of you can join in. I begin with a quote from a lovely poem by Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Mary Oliver. It closes with this question: tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And why I love this quote and begin here is because I hold life and the value of life at the core of really everything I do, of my values and my actions, my personal life and my professional life. And so that's the precious life portion. But she didn't leave it at that. She brought in this notion of it being wild. And that really connects with me very deeply. We live in a world that we've tamed in so many ways. We build cities, we are surrounded by walls and buildings, we have electricity and heating that mutes the wildness. I don't think that most of us would be comfortable at all really living in the wild, yet we and I think many of us, want to retain some element of wildness. It connects with a desire for freedom. So I really love that in this one line. And then it's not left at that, but she asks a question. She phrases it as a question, not a statement, and asks each of us what we plan to do. So it brings in the part of our minds that is planning, which is so present for all of us today, and action. What do we plan to do with our wild and precious life? So to me, that's the source of all of my work with leadership, responsibility, and I'll be talking in a moment about where the hope comes in. I discovered in my own life and among people I knew that awareness practices seemed very important for staying in touch with the depths and the fullness of our consciousness. But I didn't know whether lots of people in business and people who were leaders were already interested in this or could get interested. And then I discovered some wonderful research that was done by Sandra Waddick and Erica Steckler that was presented in 2009 at the Academy of Management. They had noticed that of the people who were the social and institutional entrepreneurs who created the social responsibility movement in corporations, every single one of them had an awareness personal practice. It wasn't all formal practices like meditation or contemplative prayer. Some wrote poetry, some ran by the seashore, others might reflect and paint, but all of them had some kind of consistent, regular practice that reinforced their awareness of themselves, of those around them, and of the environment. That's what allowed them to sustain their purpose over the long years necessary to create new institutions in the business world. I then had the opportunity in 2010, I was interviewing leaders and teachers of Tibetan Buddhism for my book, Inner Peace, Global Impact, Tibetan Buddhism Leadership and Work. And I got to meet one of the wonderful younger leaders among the Tibetan teachers, Mingyur Rinpoche. He was conducting a workshop at the invitation of Bill George, who had been a CEO and is now a Harvard professor. So that brought together for a leadership workshop a teacher in the wisdom traditions and a corporate CEO, something we rarely see. And Mingyur Rinpoche then, after having very successful books that were at the top of bestseller lists, left and went on a 4-year retreat with no money, with nothing but the clothes on him, walking around India and Nepal. It's kind of the most extreme kind of awareness training that there is, and historically very important in those traditions, although I don't think we expect to do that now in our modern lives. So there I am. You can picture me teaching, consulting. This shows me in the settings with some students and with corporate executives. And then I added in writing books. All of this seemed to really fit together for me, but something seemed to be missing. You notice I've got a triangle with space in the middle. And what gradually came to be clear to me was that this space could be filled by doing action research. If you're not familiar with it, action research helps us focus on ourselves as well as what we're researching. It looks at research as a systematic process of learning from what we are doing, fostering our own awareness and also collaborative awareness, so that doing, reflection, learning, and action all come together. To learn more, there's wonderful handbooks, a journal, there's many publications around the world on this. And it's actually become more used in many places outside the USA than in the USA. What I wanted to study is not actually a visible action. It's what I called moments of waking up. So what did I mean by a waking up moment? Who is awake? I got the idea when having lunch at a sidewalk cafe one day, lovely sunny day, and I saw a woman holding a baby on her lap at a nearby table, and the baby was so interested in everything, in everyone, in me, in dogs walking by, in the waiters serving food, complete aliveness and interest in what was happening around her. But is this what we mean by awake? Or do we mean someone like the Dalai Lama, who practices meditation daily for hours, who has decades of deep training, and all the people in between, an infant newly born and somebody who practices deep meditation? What do we mean by awake? Can we know if someone's awake? The wisdom traditions around the world have all spoken about waking up or being awake, but it seems like at some level it's an internal personal experience. So how do we know? How do we even know if we're awake? Personally, I've come to feel that it's a combination of this infant curiosity that we're all born with and deep training or deep patience with ourselves to remind ourselves that we want to retain both that curiosity and the wonderful training we put our minds through over the years. So instead of simply thinking of this as learning or requiring training, I began to see this as a need to reawaken our interest and curiosity. I and some colleagues conducted an action research process for several years with curiosity about our ordinary human experience and the intention to be aware in the work setting. So we were studying the action of non-action, you could say, and I love the humor in that. The project is grounded in action research. We were all doing research on ourselves. So that is what's called first-person research in the action research paradigm. We are systematically looking at our own experience. Second-person research helps to build a complete picture. It's the we, looking at what we are doing in a collaborative way. And finally, third-person experience is what is more customarily regarded as research, taking an objective stance, looking at the results of what we're doing, trying to look at it in a sense from outside. So if we look at the question of, is such inner development important for leaders? I'd like to begin with a quote from something Peter Senge mentioned in an interview that I did for the book, Inner Peace, Global Impact. He uses the term cultivation or being a cultivator, cultivating oneself, and said that if you're going to be in a position of authority, one needs to be cultivating oneself, that leaders should be people who are deeply involved in their own realization of becoming a human being. I love that phrase, deeply involved in our own realization of becoming a human being. So in this action research, and you can see the publication if you want to get it down at the bottom of the screen, we had people from all around the world. The purpose was, as I mentioned, seeing whether intending to wake it up could make a difference for people at work without long training. And the without long training, or without really any training, is because I know that leaders and managers at all level and almost anybody in the workplace always has enough to do. Nobody wants to add something to their work. So what we did in this first phase was each person looked for moments of waking up in their workplace for 3 to 4 weeks, looking for these moments several times a week and taking notes on that. Then we collected all of the notes from everyone, and in group interviews, we reflected on the experiences afterwards, and then all 4 of us analyzed the data. The second phase of the research was something I'd wanted to do from the beginning, which was taking this into an intact workplace. And Michelle Taylor, the woman in the middle of the photo, invited me to come to her student affairs group. She's the vice president of student affairs at a large and growing university. She has about 1,000 people in her organization. And we decided to look at this theme of leadership, mindfulness, joy, and work. Not only mindfulness, but joy, because to Michelle, it was very important that she had been able to find joy in her work after losing it at one point, and then wanted to support the people in her organization in doing that. We have a book chapter coming out later this year describing the results of our study, which is still in process now. What Michelle kept saying as I worked with her was, Kathryn, make it simpler. Make it simpler. Please, even simpler than that. And what did she mean by that? Don't ask my people to take notes several times a week. Don't ask them to do anything in particular. So we had several sessions to get everyone thinking together and nourish their intention to be awake at work. This brings up the question of what is mindfulness for and what were we working with? So we were helping people become friends with what's sometimes called our monkey mind. Do you know the way that your mind seems to jump around a lot and it'll move from one thing to another? And if you want to be calm and focused, it notices instead something that happened in the past, or thinks about what's going to happen in the future, or notices someone coming into the room. That's what we call the monkey mind. But we don't want to deaden the monkey mind. We want to help it focus and be present and gently aware so that we can rest in what's potentially there, the mind's natural clarity. We supported the people in the organization and ourselves in becoming aware of what Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge call the social field, the environment around us, the group, and it led to appreciation and compassion for ourselves and others. So rather than seeing mindfulness as a tool for stress relief and improved performance, which is often how it's contextualized in the West, we just asked over and over again, what do you wish to have this be and become? What do you want the culture of student affairs to be? Connecting one's inner state and the culture of the group. So let's pause for a moment and feel your feet on the floor. Be aware of where you're sitting, of your own breathing. Notice the quality or texture of your attention as you listen. Are you both listening and aware of the setting in which you're sitting? What's the space around you? And can you feel the space around that? You may be in a room. Can you kind of sense the building space around the room you're in? And outside of that, the space in the town or city and all the people and their activity. And can you also become aware of the larger space, the sky, the horizon, and come back to your own breathing in your own self? Thank you. So how is our capacity to be present connected with organizational health? I'd say they're not only interdependent, but that being present is the very foundation of being able to create healthy organizations and a healthy society. In 2015, in creating the book Creative Social Change for the ILA, I interviewed these wonderful global thought leaders. You see on the left, Otto Scharmer with me at an ILA conference leading a session. Below us, we have Ed Schein, then Margaret Wheatley, Bob Quinn, and Peter Senge with Otto in the background. All of them form the ground of the book. The interviews with them are the first portion of creative social change. The next section we called Air and Water, bringing in further perspectives. I very much wanted the readers to be able to think about the notion of partnership as compared with domination as characteristic of societies that Riane Eisler has developed over many decades. To look at the impact of sustainability and the interdependence of sustainability and healthy organizations, the role of ethics, and then the importance of measuring what matters if we're going to move in this direction as societies. Finally, the third portion of the book looks at concrete case studies from around the world, from all different continents. We created this book, me and John Bauger and Karen Gironet, as a globally distributed team. Just like we're globally distributed now, the three of us had never met face to face. And I think that all three of us have never, in fact, still been in the same room together. So I love working at a distance with people on projects like this, because that lets the people who really need to connect to create something to connect. Finally, in closing, these are the 5 themes that emerged from the interviews with the wonderful thought leaders. And we wrote them up as questions, not answers, because it's so important to live in the question. Wholeness, interdependence, and relatedness within our organizations, in other words. Are we aware of who we depend on within the organization and what we depend on as an organization? And what happens when these interdependencies are weakened? Inclusion or inclusivity. Are we considering some people, some living beings, as less important than others? And what's the effect of that on us, not only on them? Then health isn't only some kind of state. It's a process of removing toxins and rebalancing, just like health in the body. Finally, do we take time to reflect? Do we reflect in order, as I'm discussing with regard to action research, to have meaningful data about what we're noticing and what we're aware of? At this point, we're going to transition to Éliane and hear from her about her experience. And I really look forward to hearing from you, Éliane.
Thank you, Kathryn. So it's really a great pleasure for me to be on this call today for many reasons. I come from Rwanda, and so the story I share with you is a story of my own journey of rediscovering a way forward from suffering to hope. And it's also a journey of the Rwandan people. And interestingly, today in Rwanda, an event called Transform Africa is happening that's bringing African heads of state, young leaders, young innovators together to look at how can we grow Africa in ways that we have not yet imagined. And so about 30 years ago, I had these well-made plans coming to Canada to study in agriculture at McGill, but things that I had not predicted happened. And what happened in Rwanda created for me a inner space that made me realize the power of leadership, that we as humanity have the power to either bring about phenomenal change or really bring about the worst in ourselves. And so what I've come to realize is that leadership is about bringing vision so we can act and inspire others to move forward. And one of the things I love about transformation is this idea that we never have to work with the operating reality that is existing, but to change something, we can create new models, and these new models will make the existing models obsolete. So in order to move from the space of suffering, one of the things that has helped me is collective dreaming. And collective dreaming has reconnected me to colleagues in Africa, and we've dreamt together about ways of working collaboratively to bring healing on the continent. And this goes back for me many, many years. My mother is now deceased, but my mother in the early 80s was in the US and had this opportunity to meet with Coretta Scott King at the event that launched the Continental Africa Chamber of Commerce in 1981. And this was really a place of how do we increase partnerships between the USA and Africa and move forward in ways that build partnerships. And so for me, years later, when I held my first women's workshop in Rwanda, and we brought women from all over the continent together, for me, being able to spend time with colleagues from Congo and look at how we as women of Africa could work together to really help each other move forward was a very powerful moment. And so this idea of imaging a new way forward really requires being able to touch the suffering we've been through, but also find a third thing, some form that allows us to rediscover a way forward. And transforming the collective unconsciousness has been really critical to Rwandan women's leadership. And that leadership has really been focused on love, grounded in the love of the people we lost, grounded in the children that we see growing up and who didn't know the genocide, and how do we ensure that they don't know the horrors that were lived through? And how do we accept the death and rebirth process to be able to design this in ways that really allow traditional wisdom to inform how we use technological leapfrogging to move forward in ways we had not imagined forward? And so visioning this pathway has been very critical because it's so easy to be engulfed in our suffering and be paralyzed by our suffering. As much as it is important to touch our suffering, it is important to have a vision that guides us into spaces that are emerging, that we may not know yet, but allow us to partner in ways that really allow us to work locally and globally in ways that transforms ourselves and also ensures that the horrors of the past will never happen again. I love this quote by Einstein: "No problem can be solved from the level of consciousness that created it." What's really critical about this is that in 2050, most of the world population will be coming from the less developed countries in the world. Between now and 2050, 50% of births will be coming from Africa. And so we are in 2017, and it's very clear to all of us, no matter where we live, that there is no problem in one area in the world that cannot affect us. The good that comes from global exchanges allows us to have the best goods from everywhere in the corner, but also exposes us to the vulnerabilities of terrorism, the vulnerabilities of climate change. Here in Montreal right now, there are heavy floodings that have affected many, many friends and colleagues. And so the reality of this complex world we live in, where warfare, where climate, where technologies are so critical, how do we consciously design spaces that will really allow us to build a sustainable, creative society, a healthy world where creative social change is our collective way forward? And one of the things that has been really critical for me is the idea of memory. We are community, and when we remember community and when we can get beyond our inner cynic, we can rediscover our wholeness in the diversity that holds us together as humanity. And as we engage anew together, we really have that opportunity to move in ways that we were never able before. And for me, what was been very interesting about listening to Kathryn is this idea of awaking. And what is it we learn from each other as we awake to our collective realities, inner and outer? And what I want to initiate in this dialogue, this new section of this webinar with Kathryn, is really what really matters and what can we do in order to engage collectively and individually to really allow creative social change to happen. And so Kathryn, are you there?
I am indeed.
Great. So maybe just to initiate the dialogue, I just wanted to ask you, so I love action research, and what you were presenting was very powerful in terms of what the potential of action research allows. And I wanted you to add, from everything you were saying, what are the new elements you learned in this action research? What was surprising to you that came out of this research?
I love your question. So surprising and not surprising both, because ideally you go into research with, you do have some idea most of the time of what you hope, but you have to put that on the side, right? So what we saw in both times we did this, in phase 1 and phase 2, was that the people participating became more aware of the natural environment around them. In the first phase, people started speaking about trees, about the sky, about the difference in pace between the people that were rushing around them and how they felt inside, say, as they were commuting to work in public transport. They became very aware of the effect of the environment and the importance of the natural environment. And then the same thing happened in Utah. People who had been not paying attention to the gorgeous mountains that there are in Utah suddenly started noticing them when driving to work every day. And people would comment that they had kind of shut them out because they felt they needed to focus on work, and instead they started letting them in to nourish them. I see this as really important because it's very interesting to think that an individual personal practice of mindfulness could connect directly to sustainability. The other thing that's been really interesting, particularly in the second phase in the workplace, was that one after another, the people participating mentioned that they felt a renewed sense of purpose in work and a renewed sense of connection with those they were supposed to be serving in student affairs, in other words, the students. And when I look at the mindfulness research that's out there, as I mentioned, it seems to have more to do with stress relief and performance improvement, whereas ours seem to connect more with people's values and goals and the importance of sustainability. Shifting to you, Éliane, I was fascinated by hearing you speak about love. Could you talk some more about how this comes out in your work, this notion of love being practical rather than just something that's inside of us? I mean, looking at waking up and looking at love, they're both kind of inner experiences, and yet it turns out that they can have vast impact on the world.
So what's really interesting about me is the notion of love and the notion of power. So we all know about the idea of we can have a love of power, or we can live in a space where love is the space of power. And what's really interesting about this is love and power are really opposite sides of a same coin. And power is the shadow form of love. And what really was very interesting for me in terms of reflecting on my own journey and women's journey in Rwanda is how the love we had for the children of Rwanda, the love we had of the people we lost, the love we have for the future possibilities of Rwanda were central in how women moved forward. And one of the examples I talk about in my book chapter is about Ingoma, which is a group of women drummers in Rwanda. And traditionally, drumming in Rwanda is a sacred form that was only performed by men. But this group of women, after the genocide in 1994, came together and brought women who had been victimized, women from all sides. So women who had family members who were killed, women who had family members who had killed. So it was really the whole spectrum of women in Rwanda coming together to drum together. And this idea of a new drum, the meaning of Ingoma. And also at the same time, they also dreamed up of ways that women who couldn't be joining this drumming group could help. And they worked with local farmers, with women who wanted to be involved in this movement of helping Rwanda transform, and created a space in the south of Rwanda where the women who couldn't be part of the drumming group that has been touring now all over the world, a documentary has been done on this phenomenal group of women that was started by Kiki Katese. And at the same time, these women also worked with local farmers and started an ice cream shop in partnership with Jenny Dundas, who was from Brooklyn. And this was interesting because it's a partnership also between North American women, Rwandan women, and they worked together to build something that is called Nzozi Nziza, and it means sweet dreams. And it was an ice cream shop in the south of Rwanda. And so part of the proceeds of this, the ice cream sales, go back to the drumming group, but also brings the community together to gather around the sweetness of life, and also allows inclusion. So it's not about whether you have that capacity to be a phenomenal drummer that makes everybody vibrate when they hear you drumming, but it's also the idea that you don't have to be this gifted person, but you can be part of this movement, either by being a farmer who's giving produce to the ice cream shop, by a woman who is selling ice cream and is smiling at clients and exchanging with clients all day. And so the idea of embodied love and how the fear, the horror, the trauma, the sadness we hold within us is there. But if we cultivate the space of love, we touch the present, and the more we are in our present, the more awake we become. And so this is where I would see the link between awaking and love.
That's beautiful, Éliane. That's just really beautiful. I would like to take a moment to connect this back to the book and the larger dialogue, because having us here together is part of what I hope to happen with this book. I really wanted the book not to be just something that is like words on paper, but something that would stimulate dialogue and conversation and questioning among people around the world on the kinds of issues and themes that we're discussing here, on what is involved in leading towards a healthy world at whatever level one's at in whatever part of the world. And I'm really hoping that people will see the relevance of this to all different kinds of courses and consulting work, so that this questioning of how do we shift from whatever state we're in, hopefully most people don't have to deal with the horrors that the Rwandan people faced with genocide. But today we know that in many societies, many parts of the world, there are really, really difficult situations. And to even begin imagining that a shift is possible towards a healthy world is so important. And then to focus on what does matter and what we can do wherever we are, that we don't need to be someone else or have more power or be in a different level in an organization, that wherever we are, there's something we can do.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to, in the foreword of the book, there is a great quote by Nelson Mandela, and it was noted by Lord Allardyce when a group he was involved in from Northern Ireland went to South Africa to meet with Nelson Mandela. And I just want to share this because I think it's very central to the book and what we're talking about. So Nelson Mandela said, "I am not here to tell you how to solve your problems, but what I can do is tell you our story. And if there are parts of that story that resonate for you, that help you in your journey, then that's a useful thing for all of us. And it's good for us to have met." And so what I find very powerful about the Creative Social Change book in terms of building leadership for a healthy world is, as the more we share our stories, the more we connect to each other's humanity. And the more we connect to each other's humanity, the more we can see behind our fears, our anxieties, our anger, we can see that space of love that connects all of us, and we are able to work collectively in ways that really bring about positive change.
Bravo, that's beautiful. I think even in preparing this webinar, Éliane, I saw more and more the importance of listening for our own stories and cultivating them and sharing them, because I think that when we lose the connection with the juiciness, with the healthfulness possible in our own lives, we lose so much. And I think that that is what happens. What I think that at a deep sense is what it means to wake up, is to be connected with the alive part of our own stories. And to me, that's what one thing that action research can help us do. I see that my dissertation students have been doing that by studying people like themselves. People are often told in doing dissertations to study something that is not involved with their own life or it'll slow them down. But what I found is that when people studied women or other people who were doing things that were similar to the students' lives, things that the students had passion for, whether or not it speeded them up, it nourished them, invigorated them, and helped them create something of high quality. So almost all my students in the last few years have done that kind of work. Shall we transition to opening this up to people out there listening?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, so at this point, you guys can raise your hand, and I already have one question from someone who typed it to me by Kathryn Bingham, and she says, I love that we are seeing a blossoming of presencing conscious leadership, collective leadership, and collaborative engagements on a broader scale. I know pulling this together was encouraging and rewarding. Could you each share a moment where, in the process, you experienced an, oh wow, this could be anything, an epiphany, a connection, a moment of profound impact?
Kathryn, can you start?
Not so easy to go to profound impact instantly, but I can share a moment that, Kathryn, that was this morning after going through the slides multiple times, talking with Éliane, doing some practice sessions. Waking up from sleep today was when I really saw the connection of action research and story. As a young person, I studied literature and was very interested in science fiction to kind of take me away from a focus just on the mundane of life. But I see now that what I've been able to do, and I didn't see it until preparing the webinar, was move from that to using action research in life to help people develop their own voice, to tell stories relevant to understanding their own lives and the lives of others. And that really was kind of an epiphany for me. How about you, Éliane?
Well, I love that you're talking about science fiction. So for the last 10 years, I've been on this Presidential Advisory Council of Rwanda, and I'm on a new council now on science and technology. And when I look back 10 years ago, when the discussions we had on the Presidential Advisory Council, some of it seemed like science fiction in terms of the transformations that we were dreaming up collectively on where Rwanda could move forward. And a month ago, I was in Kigali, and I was there for this science and technology meeting, but I was also there for the launch of the Next Einstein Forum headquarters in Kigali. And the principles of the Next Einstein Forum is that the next Einstein should be African. And so there's these networks of African Institute for Mathematical Sciences that have been put in place in Rwanda, initiated by astrophysicist Neil Turek. And what's exciting to me is that there's this new generation of African youth that have an expertise in mathematics that can allow them to use algorithms to do work from financial projections to climate change to looking at HIV/AIDS and epidemiology, modeling diseases, or looking at outer space research. And so what visioning is, in a way, is related to science fiction because it allows us to dream beyond what is of reach. And when we're able to do that, it's astonishing what can happen. And so there was a moment for me when I was in Kigali at the new convention center that's absolutely gorgeous. And I was concluding a panel on science, technology, and gender. And here I was, and I realized that the dreams we had 10 years ago had almost all of them been realized, and that the youth I was meeting that were part of this new network of African Institute for Mathematical Sciences would bring to Africa things in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years that I could have never imagined for the continent or for the world. And so for me, there's that excitement.
That's lovely. Do we have other questions?
Yes,
Otherwise, I'll jump in and come. Okay, great.
Yes, we have a question from Haiti. Her question is, thank you very much for your informative and helpful presentation. How leaders can engage their followers to play a positive role in the social change process?
One of the things I think is really sort of critical about followership is leaders' capacity to listen. And often I think we've talked about the importance of our stories and the validity of our stories and finding power in our stories. And one of the issues in the 21st century, and it's been critical if we look at recent elections around the world, whether we look at Brexit, elections in the US, or the recent election in France, is people in general feel powerless. But when we take back our power and realize that what we can do as followers determines the type of leaders we have, and this has been amazing in terms of in France that an extreme right group was defeated by a huge margin. And so what is really critical is what are the values we want to cultivate, and can we in our stories highlight those values as followers so that the leaders we have, the leaders we elect, the leaders that will guide us moving forward are really grounded in the values that we hold at heart, and that they know that we will hold them accountable, that we are taking our values responsibly and want to make sure that what it is we want for the world is reflected in the leadership they bring.
It's beautiful. To add just one other thing, I mean, I was just delighted when you jumped in with listening. I think another aspect of it, of this though, is to be present as a whole person. If I look at our project, the specific one in Utah, what was really important to, as a beginning for a culture change process, was that Michelle went through a process of change herself and was willing to be open about this with her people and not try to hide it. So not try to put up a sort of a veneer, a TV personality, so to speak, but to be herself. The other side of this, though, and I've often had people ask, well, does that mean just, however you are, you just kind of let it all hang out? And it really doesn't, because one needs to be, and there's that word responsible for cultivation, as you mentioned, and as Sengi used the term, that you can really only be authentic as an adult, mature leader if you've also cultivated yourself. So if you have cultivated your ability to listen, to be fully present, to listen to the different parts of yourself, to be patient with the clamoring parts of oneself and others, and to really respect all others, then I think we can have the kind of shift that you were speaking to. Jill, do we have more?
Yes, we have a question coming in from Desiree.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you, Desiree.
Thank you guys for being here today. This is awesome. You guys just mentioned about listening, being present, and responsibility. as far as being an authentic leader who's kind of grown into themselves. And so I'm wondering about a level of transparency when you are that actual awakened leader that interacts with people who are seeking that same awakening, but somehow are stuck in maybe it's fear or denial. How do you get them to move along without necessarily damaging your own personal process?
So there's an image I love of the artist's eye in terms of sculpting, that the idea that the image is in the stone already, and it's about taking off the layers so that it can really shine out. And I think one of the things about human beings and the process of revealing ourselves to each other is making sure that everybody understands that there is nothing wrong with who we are, but it's the process of revealing ourselves to each other that is important. And I think as leaders, what's really important is to create a space where people are okay with failure, are okay with stumbling, are okay with the process of growth, that we're here to grow together, and that we will grow faster in certain directions, slower in others, and that the more compassion we have for each other in the process, the less resistance we will have in terms of showing those shadow, vulnerable spaces to each other. And the more we'll be able to access the creativity that hides within that vulnerability, and so that our real selves can shine through those spaces that we have surrounded ourselves and tried to protect ourselves in. And so it's really, how do we as leaders create that safe space for people to know that we're all growing together, we will all fall and rise up together, and that we're here for each other to help each other grow.
That's beautiful. I don't need to add. Let's see if we can hear from others too.
Yes, of course. We now have a question from Gloria Steiner, and she says, "Thank you very much for this intriguing presentation. Do both of you think that cultural relativism is an important concept for leadership today? If yes, can you give concrete examples?"
So I don't know, cultural relativism has a lot of very specific meanings in philosophy and in different fields of study. So I'm not sure that it's a term that I would want to kind of tangle with a yes or no answer, Gloria. But what I would say is that being respectful of different cultures and different sets of tradition is very important. Because, I mean, the questions are, there's always aspects of almost every culture that seem worthy of respect, and other parts where it might be questionable. So to say overall, yes, we respect all cultures, gets a little tricky because of that. And I can't get into a specific example right now, just don't have one. Do you, Éliane?
Well, one of the things for me that's really important is our beliefs are based on our emotions, and that doesn't necessarily align with truth. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so what's really important for me is to have immense awareness of culture, but also to allow a space of saying, is this the highest form that we each bring into our leadership, into our fellowship? Is this the highest form we bring in terms of the collective wisdom we can harness together? And so awareness of culture is important, because awareness of culture will let us know what are the beliefs that frame where we are, and what are the energies that drive us. And that's very critical. But at the same time, if really our intent is creative social change, we have to hold that at the same time as we hold the capacity for visioning and collective work.
Okay, great. And we actually have time for about one more question. So we are now
Do
going...
we have any more hands raised? It would be lovely to hear another voice.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. We're going to hear from Maria now.
Thank you so much. I'm a professor at Soka University teaching a leadership seminar, and we're actually using the book Creative Social Change as our textbook this semester. And so for that, I want to thank you both. And my question is this. From youth, I often get the question, am I really a player in this leadership world? Or when will I become a player? When am I eligible to be an agent of social change? And so my question is, how would you reply to this? What message do you have to youth?
So for me, it's a very interesting question, because when I'm in Rwanda and other countries in Africa, about 70% of Africans are under 30, maybe in some countries under 15. And so they represent an immense force. And the work I do, my advisory role in Rwanda, is all about what is the enabling environment we want to create so youth can do amazing things. And so, for example, a friend of mine who's 27 who's Rwandan, started a company when he was 13. And so I think the label of age is something, it's a mental framework. And this is also comes back to the idea of power. And are we giving our stories the validity, the space, the compassion that we need to give them? And when we're able to do that, we can allow ourselves to vision whatever we want for ourselves. So I was talking earlier about this event, Transform Africa, that's happening in Kigali today. And one of the stories that I was reading this morning are about two young Rwandans who were looking at the cost of sending money back home and how expensive it was. And one of them was a programmer and developed this app to allow students to receive and send money from their families in Africa with very little or no transaction fees. And now they've raised money in Silicon Valley. They have gotten attention all over Rwanda. They have about 40,000 transactions, I think, happening monthly. And these are young people who had an idea. There was a problem, and they used what they knew to move forward. And so I think there is immense power in youth. And what's important is that they are able to see that they have power. And in order to see that they have positive power, they need to have a space of self-compassion that allows their self-confidence, self-esteem to be of service to the vision that they have of how they can help bring about positive change.
Absolutely. And just adding one more thought, I mean, if we look at Malala Yousafzai, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, but she has had so much impact on the world. And she was quite young, and she just stood up at great personal cost for learning, for doing what made sense at her level of life. So I think that for everyone, what we have to do is see how, as we were discussing earlier, stay connected with what we value in our lives and how that's an unfolding story, and not lose that thread, whatever age we are, because a similar thing can be true as one ages and one is sort of cast aside in many societies as not being someone to listen to anymore as you get older. So really, if we look at it, if we dismiss the youth and the old people, we're not, we're getting rid of very much of the human beings on the planet as sources of creative social change and of energy and life. So I think that respecting everyone and helping everyone stay connected with their own value as a human being is really very fundamental.
I love that.
Okay, thank you both so much, and thank you all for your very thoughtful questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's webinar. However, if you have more questions and you wish to continue the conversation, I know I did not get to a bunch of people's questions, then you can do so on the Hub ILA website by logging into your Intersections account. Kathryn will also be in Brussels for the ILA conference in October, so if you are in attendance, you will have the opportunity to speak and connect with her there. In addition, just a reminder that Kathryn and Éliane are giving away 2 free copies of Creative Social Change. I will be randomly selecting after the webinar, and I will reach out to the winners. If you are not selected, the book is available on Amazon for purchase. The webinar will also be available within 48 hours to access free on the ILA website. So if you missed something, want to watch it again, or wish to share with a colleague or friend, the webinar will be archived on ILA, and the instructions with how to access it will be emailed to you after the webinar. So I just want to thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Kathryn and Éliane, for a wonderful presentation, and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their days.
Thank you very much.